Hi and welcome to the Tristan channel. Today I'll be telling you about the life of famous occultist John Dee. John Dee was born in Tower Ward, London, to Roland Dee of Welsh descent and Joanna, daughter of William Wilde. His surname Dee reflects the Welsh du, meaning black. His grandfather was Bedu Dudu of the Nant y Gros, Pelef Radneshire. John retained his connection with the locality. His father, Roland, was a mercer and a gentleman courtier to Henry VIII. John Dee claimed descent from Rhodri the Great, King of Wales, and constructed a pedigree accordingly. His family had arrived in London with Henry Tudor's coronation as Henry VII. Dee attended Chelmsford Chantry School, which is now King Edward VI Grammar School, from 1535 to 1542. He entered St John's College, Cambridge, in November 1542, aged 15, graduating BA in 1545 or early 1546. His abilities recognised, he became an original Fellow of the Trinity College, Cambridge, on its foundation by Henry VIII in 1546. At Trinity, the clever stage effects he produced for a production of Astrophans piece earned him lasting repute as a magician. In the late 1540s and early 1550s, he travelled in Europe, studying at Louvain and Brussels and lecturing in Paris on Illucid. He studied under Gemma Fruis and became friends with the cartographers Grodardus Mercator and Abraham Ortelius. He also worked along from the continental mathematicians such as Federico Comandano in Italy. He returned to England with a major collection of mathematical and astronomical instruments. In 1552, he met Girolamo Cardano in London, with whom he investigated a portrait perpetual motion engine and a gem supposed to have magical properties. Rector at Upton upon Severn from 1553, Dee was offered a readership in mathematics at Oxford University in 1554, which he declined, citing as offensive English university's emphasis on rhetoric and grammar over philosophy and science, the more advanced quadrivium composed of arithmetic, geometry, music, and astronomy. He was busy with writing and perhaps hoped for a better position at court. In 1555, Dee joined the Worshipful Company of Mercers, as his father had, through its system of patrimony. In that same year, Dee was arrested and charged with the crime of calculating, because he had cast horoscopes of Queen Mary and Princess Elizabeth. The charges were raised treason against Mary. Dee appeared in the Star Chamber and exonerated himself, but was turned over to the Catholic Bishop Bonner for religious examination. His strong lifelong penchant for secrecy may have worsened matters. The episode was the most dramatic in the series of attacks and slanders that dogged Dee throughout his life. Clearing his name yet again, he soon became a close associate of Bonner. Dee presented Queen Mary in 1556 with a visionary plan preserving old books, manuscripts and records and founding a national library, but it was not taken up. Instead, he expanded his personal library in Mortlake, acquiring books and manuscripts in England and on the continent. Dee's library, a centre of learning outside the universities, became the greatest in England and attracted many scholars. When Elizabeth succeeded to the throne in 1558, Dee became her astrological and scientific advisor, even choosing her coronation date. From the 1550s to 1570s, he served as an advisor to England's voyages of discovery, providing technical aid in navigation and political support to create a British Empire, a term he was first to use. He wrote in October 1574 to William Cecil, 1st Barony Burghley, seeking patronage. He claimed to have occult knowledge of treasure in the Welsh marshes and of valuable manuscripts kept at Wigmore Castle, knowing that Lord Treasure's ancestors came from the area. In 1564, Dee wrote the hermetic work Monus Hieroglyphica, the hieroglyphic monad, an exhaustive Kabbalist interpretation of a glyph of his own design meant to express the mystical unity of all creation. Having dedicated it to Maximilian II, Holy Roman Emperor, in an effort to gain patronage, Dee attempted to present it to him at the time of his ascension to the throne of Hungary. The work was esteemed by many of Dee's contemporaries, but cannot be interpreted today in absence of the secret oral tradition of that era. His 1517 mathematical preface to Henry Billingsley, English translation of Elucid's Elements, argued for the importance of mathematics as an influence on the other arts and sciences. Intended for an audience outside the universities, it proved to be Dee's most widely influential and frequently reprinted work. In 1577, Dee published general and rare memorials pertaining to the perfect arte of navigation, a work setting out his vision of a maritime empire and asserting English territorial claims on a new world. Dee was acquainted with Humphrey Gilbert and close to Sir Philip Sidney and his circle. By the early 1580s, Dee was discontented with his progress in learning the secrets of nature and his diminishing influence and recognition in court circles. Failure of his ideas concerning proposed calendar revision, colonial establishments and ambivalent results for voyages of exploration in North America had nearly brought his hopes of political patronage to an end. As a result, he began a more energetic turn towards the supernatural as a means to acquire knowledge. He sought to contact spirits through the use of a scryer or crystal gazer, which he thought would act as an intermediary between himself and the angels. Dee's first attempts with several scryers were unsatisfactory, but in 1582 he met Edward Kelly, who then called himself Edward Talbot, to disguise his conviction for coining or forgery, who impressed him greatly with his abilities. Dee took Kelly into his service and began to devote all his energies to his supernatural pursuits. These spiritual conferences or actions were conducted with intense Christian piety, always after periods of purification, prayer and fasting. Dee was convinced of the benefits they could bring to mankind. The character of Kelly is harder to assess. Some conclude that he acted with cynicism, but delusion or self-deception cannot be ruled out. Kelly's output is remarkable for its volume, intricity, and vividness. Dee claimed that angels laboriously dictated several books to him this way through Kelly, some in special angelic or Enochian language. In 1583, Dee met the impoverished yet popular Polish nobleman Albert Lasky, who, after overstating his welcome at court, invited Dee to accompany him back to Poland. With some prompting by the angels again, through Kelly, and by dint of his worsening status at court, Dee decided to do so. He, Kelly, and their families left in September 1583, but Lasky proved to be bankrupt and out of favour in his own country. Dee and Kelly began a nomadic life in Central Europe, meanwhile continuing their spiritual conferences, which Dee detailed in his diaries and almanacs. They had audience with Emperor Rudolf II in Prague, Castle and King Stefan Batory of Poland, whom they attempted to convince of the importance of angelic communication. The Batory meeting took place at Castle and was later analysed by Polish historians. While Dee was generally seen as a man of deep knowledge, he was mistrusted for his connection with the English monarch Elizabeth I, for whom some thought thought and still do that Dee was a spy. The Polish king, a devout Catholic and cautious of supernatural mediators, began their meetings by affirming that prophetic revelations must match the teachings of Christ, the mission of the Holy Catholic Church, and approval of the Pope. Pardon me. In 1587, a spiritual conference in Bohemia, Kelly told Dee that the angel Uriel had ordered the men to share all their possessions, including their wives. By this time, Kelly had gained some renown as an alchemist and was more sought after than Dee in this regard. It was a line of work that had prospects for serious and long-time financial gain, especially among the royal families of Central Europe. Dee, however, was more interested in communicating with angels, whom he believed would help him solve the mysteries of the heavens through mathematics, optics, astrology, science, and navigation. Perhaps Kelly, in fact, wished to end Dee's dependence on him as a diviner at their increasingly lengthy, frequent spiritual conferences. The order for wife sharing caused Dee anguish, but he apparently did not doubt it was genuine, and they apparently shared wives. However, Dee broke off the conferences immediately afterwards. He returned to England in 1589, while Kelly went on to be the alchemist to Emperor Rudolf II. 9 months later, on 28th of February 1588, a son was born to Dee's wife, whom Dee baptised Theodorus Trebonianus Dee, and raised him as his own, though he may have been Kelly's, as Dee was 60 at the time and Kelly 32. Dee returned to Mortlake after 6 years abroad to find his home vandalised, his library ruined, and many of his prized books and instruments stolen. Furthermore, he found that increasing criticism of the occult practices had made England still less hospitable to his magical practices and natural philosophy. He sought support from Elizabeth, who he hoped could persuade Kelly to return and ease England's economic burdens through alchemy. She finally appointed Dee Warden of Christ's College, Manchester, in 1592. This former college of priests had been re-established as a Protestant institution by royal charter in 1578. However, he could not exert much control over its fellows, who despised or cheated him. Early in his tenure, he was consulted on the demonic possession of 7 children, but took little interest in the case, although he allowed those involved to consult his still extensive library. Dee left Manchester in 1605 to return to London, but remained warden until his death. By the time that Elizabeth was dead, and James I gave him no support, Dee spent his final years in poverty at Mortlake, forced to sell off various possessions to support himself and his daughter Catherine, who cared for him until his death in Mortlake late in 1608, or early in 1609, aged 81. Both the parish registers and Dee's gravestone are missing. In 2013, a memorial plaque to Dee was placed on the south wall of the present church. Some 10 years after Dee's death, the antiquarian Robert Cotton bought land around Dee's house and began digging for papers and artefacts. He found several manuscripts, mainly records of Dee's angelic communications. Cotton's son gave these to the scholar Merrick Casaubon, who published them in 1659 with a long introduction critical of their author as a true and faithful relation of what passed for many years between Dr. John Dee and some spirits. As the first public revelation of Dee's spiritual conferences, the book was popular. Casaubon, who believed in the reality of spirits, argued in his introduction that Dee was acting as the unwitting tool of evil spirits when he believed he was communicating with angels. This book is mainly responsible for the image prevalent for the next 2.5 centuries of Dee as a dupe and deluded fanatic. About the time the True and Faithful Relation was published, members of the Rosicrucian movement claimed Dee as one of their number. There is doubt, however, that an organised Rosicrucian movement existed in Dee's lifetime, and no evidence he ever belonged to any secret fraternity. His reputation as a magician and the vivid story of his association with Edward Kelly have made him a seemingly irresistible figure to fabulists, writers of horror stories, and latter-day magicians. The aggregation of fanciful information about Dee often obscures the facts of his life. Remarkable as they were, it also does nothing to promote his Christian leanings. Dee looked to the angels to tell him about how he might heal the deep and serious rift between the Roman Catholic Church and the Reformed Church of England, and the Protestant movement in England. Queen Elizabeth I used him several times as her court astronomer, not solely because he practiced hermetic arts, but as a deeply religious and learned trustworthy man. A revelation of Dee's character and significance came in the 20th century largely through the work of the historians Charlotte Fell Smith and Dame Frances Yates. Both brought into focus the parallel roles of magic, science and religion in the Elizabethan Renaissance. Fell Smith writes, "There is perhaps no learned author in history who has been so persistently misjudged, nay, even slandered by his prosperity, and not a voice in all 3 centuries uplifted even to claim for him a fair hearing. Surely it is time that the cause of all this universal condemnation should be examined in the light of reason and science. And perhaps it will be found to exist mainly in the fact that he was not too far advanced in speculative thought for his own age to understand." Through this and subsequent re-evaluation, Dee is now viewed as a serious scholar and book collector, a devout Christian, an able scientist, and one of the most learned men of his day. His Mortlake Lake Library was the largest in the country before it was vandalised and created at enormous, sometimes ruinous, personal expense. It was seen as one of the finest in Europe, perhaps second only to that of Thal. As well as being an astrological and scientific advisor to Elizabeth and her court, he was an early advocate of colonisation of North America, envisioning a British Empire stretching across the North Atlantic. Dee promoted the sciences of navigation and cartography. He studied closely with Gerardus MacArthur and owned an important collection of maps, globes and astronomical instruments. He developed new instruments and special navigational techniques for use in polar regions. Dee served as an advisor to English voyagers of discovery and personally selected pilots and trained them in navigation. He believed that mathematics, which he understood mystically, was central to human learning. The centrality of mathematics to Dee's vision makes him to that extent more modern than Francis Bacon, though some scholars believe Bacon purposely downplayed mathematics in the anti-occult atmosphere of reign of James I. Although Dee's understanding of the role of mathematics differs much from ours in promotion outside the universities, was an enduring achievement. For most of his writings, Dee chose English rather than Latin to make them accessible to the public. His mathematical preface to the Elucid was meant to promote the study and application of mathematics by those without a university education, and was popular and influential among the machinations, a growing class of technical craftsmen and artisans. Dee's preface includes demonstrations of mathematical principles that readers could perform themselves without special education or training. In the 20th century, the municipal borough of Richmond, now known as London Borough of Richmond upon Thames, honoured John Dee by naming a street near Mortlake Dee Road. To 21st century eyes, Dee's activities straddled magic and modern science, but the distinction would have meant nothing to him. He was invited to lecture on Euclidean geometry at the University of Paris while he was still in his early 20s. He was an ardent promoter of mathematics, a respected astronomer, and a leading expert in navigation, who trained many who would conduct England's voyages of discovery. Meanwhile, he immersed himself in sorcery, astrology, and Hermetic philosophy. Much effort in his last 30 years went into trying to commune with angels so as to learn the universal languages of creation and achieve a pre-apocalyptic unity of mankind. A student of the Renaissance Neoplatonic of Malisso Finiso, he drew no distinctions between his mathematical research and his investigations of hermetic magic, angel summoning, and divination. All his activities were part of his quest for transcendence, understanding of divine forms, underlining the visible world, Dee's pure verities. Dee amassed one of England's biggest libraries. His scholarly status also took him into Elizabethan politics as an advisor and tutor to Elizabeth I, and through relations with her ministers Francis Walsingham and William Cecil, he tutored and patronised Sir Philip Sidney, his uncle Robert Dudley, 1st Earl of Leicestershire, Edward Dyer, and Sir Christopher Hatton. So there you go. Butchered through those. A video on John Dee. Sorry, John Dee, sorry, not John Dee. So if you like the video, hit the like. And if you haven't, then please show your support by subscribing to the channel. Until next time, folks, take care.